like that? Excellent.
I'm quite looking forward to Russell's queer theory section this week, Mick.
Yes, well, that's what we've got coming up next. And as I said earlier on, he went to a walkthrough at the Nottingham Contemporary and looked at some art. And, yes, had some sort of insight given by, I can't remember the guy's name, but Russell will tell us in a moment, who's from Trent University.
Right.
And delves into a bit of queer theory.
Oh, does he?
Yes, he does. And, yes, gave us a bit of a different take on the art that was there.
Great.
We have to, well, not apologise, but just explain that the levels on this recording will be a little bit variable because it was recorded in a public space. Russell does his talk over, and that was done in the studio, so that's fine. But the kind of on-site recordings were done in a public space, which is subject to other people using the space.
I hate other people.
Hell is other people.
Hell is other robots.
Yeah, really. Where's that one from?
Futurama.
Oh. But yeah, so some of the levels are a bit variable, and you will get the odd bit of interference and crackling, but it's not your radio or laptop, whatever you're listening on. It's us.
Oh, Russell, our bona to Vardia, Dolly Odie. Lay it on me, girl.
Hello, and welcome to the Aquaricon, where we hopefully queer things up a little and derange them. Queer here doesn't really matter who you sleep with. It is defined by queerness, not by gender. Queer is a tautology, self-defining only by the queer, and the queer demands its perpetual revolution. So come with us, and don't become a static, appropriated fashion, a reified appearance of queerness, in that stone immobility or tribal identification that is the unqueer. I am your host in all things disruptive and deconstructive, and I'll hold your hand however you identify, or don't. I am Russell Christie, and this is the Aquaricon. This evening we'll be taking an amble through the queer room of the current exhibition at the Nottingham Contemporary Gallery, this one running until December the 31st. The queerest bit of the Contemporary's current exhibition, or is it, is a queer film double bill by Berlin-based filmmakers Pauline Boudry and Renate Lorenz. Now, before we have a listen to a walk around this exhibit conducted by Gary Needham, who's a lecturer in film and television studies at Nottingham Trent and who is seriously interested in Andy Warhol and queer theory, let's have a reflection on the Nottingham Contemporary Gallery, to ease some of our queer qualms. Well, it's a corporate space. People have described it to me as an arrogant and alienating building. There's certainly a lot of cement. What, you think art works in mixed media? This is the world for you. It would not be queer to get used to it. On the other hand, on the inside, there are often queer and certainly LGBT goings-on, and the folks on the inside attempt to shake things up as much as they can, even extolling the art takeovers of Castro's revolution. But the building, as you know, has thick walls and firm foundations. So, Pauline Boudry and Renate Lorenz, the filmmakers we are concerned with today, what does their blurb say? Let me search engine them for you. Our works often revisit materials from the past, a score, a piece of music, a film, a photograph, or a performance, wandering about and excavating unrepresented or illegible moments of utopia in history. We work with performance to create embodiments which are able to conflate different times, drawing relations between these times. We often create illegitimate collaborations, partly fictitious, partly cross-temporal. Flipping heck. Well, maybe we can unpack this later, after we've seen the movies. So here's Gary Needham's warm-up from the walkthrough which was a public event at the gallery at 6 p.m. on November the 19th, 2015. And the first thing he does before we go into the movies is to introduce queer theory generally.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Gary Needham from Nottingham Trent University, where I'm a lecturer in film and television studies, but that's a kind of broad category that also includes kind of visual art, and my own research tends to be in performance, art, film and TV, and I've got a long history of working with and against this kind of idea that we call kind of queer theory. I want to sort of start with the idea of queer. I've got notes, by the way. And it very much comes out of US activism in the 1980s, and it is allied to obviously the UK as well, particularly around the 1980s as a particularly conservative and homophobic decade under both Reagan and Thatcher. Of course, here, Section 28 in the UK is obviously an important aspect. And there's some idea that perhaps gay and lesbian studies, or gay and lesbian people of a certain generation, were not in any way responding to both the AIDS crisis and the general culture of homophobia at the time. So a lot of kind of young upstarts, I mean, I was just, catching the tail end of this in the sort of early to mid-90s, reclaimed the homophobic term queer as an act of defiance, probably symbolised by the group Queer Nation, more known again in the US. And in a way, it took a long time for this to be imported to the UK, and a lot of the ways we got it was through the theory. If some of the Gay Times issues, for example, reporting on that are very hostile to the idea of queer and queer theory, and some of the ways in which those people were considered to be upstarts and, against the kind of the older generation. So you've got this kind of background of a kind of homophobic 80s, and at the same time as the activism and the climate, there's a lot of new, younger scholars who are not finding the answers to the problem in either gay and lesbian studies, as it was back then, or feminism. Gay and lesbian studies only really dealt with sexuality. Feminism, of course, really dealt with gender. But there was something that they caught on about the relationship between gender and sexuality as interrelated in ways that produce oppression, but also produce ideas of what is normal. In other words, one's sexuality is defined in relation to how one is appropriately gendered, either masculine or feminine, and having a male and female body. And two of the main figures coming out of this queer moment of theory, and they were also activists, were Judith Butler and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. Butler, of course, is quite perhaps better known for her book Gender Trouble, and I think the idea that queer thought, queer practice, queer activism causes trouble is something that sometimes gets lost. It was troubling both for conservatives, both for categories of identity that people thought were fairly fixed, and I guess trouble for the gays and lesbians who were quite happy to sort of assimilate, and they had money, they were quite happy to just basically ignore the problem because their life was well to do. And I'm reminded of a sort of famous t-shirt. It says, not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck you. And it's that kind of fuck you, troubling attitude that I think gets lost now in a way. There's a lot of anger, a lot of rage in the origin of the term queer. It is a fight back. But Butler, of course, if you know the work, thinks about the way in which identity is performative. And she doesn't mean like drag as a kind of performance of gender, but she means that in a grammatical sense from the linguistic concept of performativity, where actions of speech infer the act. So I thee wed, actually saying it actually marries people. And she's thought that actually our bodies, a bit like language, cite gender conventions of femininity and masculinity, and that those become fixed so that they're seen as natural rather than cultural. And that's what queer theory in a way did. It exposed the cultural framework in which gender situates as something not natural, cultural. And I don't know if you're aware of Jimmy Greer's comments of late, which have been interpreted as transphobic because she has this essentialist idea that there is an essence of women and that transgender individuals don't possess that essence because they were born biologically female. So queer theory would be against that fixity, that essentialism. Now the other figure, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, she comes up with some interesting ideas as well in the early 90s, and again relevant to the exhibition perhaps is one of her, and I can't quote directly from her, but she says more or less that what is queer is when anybody's gender and their sexuality do not monolithically align, meaning that there's some unsettling, unfixing of the relationship between gender and sexuality that exposes identity, but also exposes how homophobia works, how sexism works, how the beauty industry works, how we inhabit our own bodies. And I think it's that queer, that exploring the gender-sexuality alignment that these works obviously aim to kind of interrogate. But the other thing to say about queer is often people assume the opposite of queer is straight, but that wasn't quite the case. The opposite of straight is gay, the opposite of homosexuality is heterosexuality. Queer's opposition was this idea of normativity, or the normal. That's what it was up against. And that normativity can be both heteronormative, which often finds its outlet in kind of patriarchy, but also homonormative, in that gays themselves can reproduce normativity in relation to all sorts of ideas of capital, of labour, of gender, and so on. Right, so the work that obviously I'm here to talk about is the Boudry and Lorenz performance films, I Want and Opaque. And they are artists who, reading about them, they know their queer theory, so queer theory, the kind that I've been discussing, informs the way they approach their work. It's underpinned by many of the theoretical ideas of Butler, of Sedgwick, and also Judith Halberstam and Lee Edelman, and they're obviously influenced by the temporality issue, that time itself is often a normative concept. I mean, that's also a feminist question around the way that reproduction itself is obviously thought in terms of cycles of time. And one way I thought that the work is also queer, maybe not now so much obvious, is actually putting moving images in the gallery. For a very long time, that was quite a radical thing to do, was to put moving images in a gallery. So there's a sense in which the moving image, which is a performance rather than a live art performance, itself is already unsettling boundaries about what should be in the kind of the white cube, as it were, because cinema's the black cube, but here we have it in the white cube. Now, a few things that strike out to me about the first film is the use of split screen and the use of the disco ball. And as artists, they're often trying to think about the past and objects from queer history. So the film involves an old 70s text by performance artist Kathy Acker, performed by a contemporary performance artist. So they're already thinking about producing a queer community through their artistic practice. Even if those artists haven't met, the dialogue they explore in relation to other performance artists establishes a kind of queer artistic practice through the very connections that we hope to forge. But also in evoking the disco ball, also again evokes that history, particularly gay history, in which disco was the kind of the roots music of the gay 1970s. And of course disco was a battleground for popular culture, because disco of course was associated with gay men and women, and the whole Disco Sucks riot against that was a very homophobic Right, so the disco is about thinking about the role that disco plays in our histories in a way. Even if we don't like disco, I think it's important as a genre to the foundation of kind of gay and lesbian liberation. The other thing that seemed to me quite interesting was the use of split screen, which, as a Warhol scholar, reminds me of the Chelsea Girls. And some of the artist's other work, there's a video called Normal Love referring to another underground filmmaker called Jack Smith. So they're clearly aware of the importance of underground cinema to the formation of a kind of 60s queer identity. So they're invoking the queer Warhol, as it were, in choosing the double screen or split screen format. And the reason why I think we would say performance was important was because if you're privileged by your gender, your race, or your sexuality, you're not aware of how your identity is constructed. But as soon as you're not privileged by that, as a queer body, as a black body, as, say, even a working class body, you're aware of how socially you are produced as a subject, how politics might impact on your sense of being. It's only those who are privileged by their identity who have no awareness of it. And in a way, this is what their films do, is expose how identity works. That's what's queer about the work, is that investigation of identity, that thinking about forging a kind of community of queer artistic heritage, queer artistic practice. And some of their videos, of course, explore what it means to be too butch, too femme, to not have your voice somehow match up with your body, which of course is an important issue in transgender studies. How do you perform femininity by having the right sounding voice? It's using those questioning ideas of, is this that or is it that? The same way as the split screen is saying, do I look at this screen, do I look at that screen? Whose voice is that, whose body is that? That constant undoing of expectations, of ideas that things ought to be fixed or have essences, is very much part of the kind of the queer project, which is of course a political project as much as it is an artistic project. So I should stop.
So we huddled in to see the movies, about 10 of us. One movie represents the writings of the punk poet and novelist Kathy Acker. These are in a duet intercut with the online writings of Chelsea Manning. You remember the person still imprisoned in the US for facilitating the exposure of Iraq war documents. This monologue-dialogue is acted out by a single person in a cell or discotheque. This movie is called I Want. The other movie, called Opaque, is based on quotes from a documentary by the Weather Underground organisation, a small revolutionary organisation founded in 1969 and dedicated to the violent overthrow of capitalism in America. These sayings are combined with the text from Jean Genet, that well-known French reprobate, homosexual and supporter of the Black Panthers. This script is dressed up by queer presenters in a derelict and dodgy building with lots of curtains and smoke. And so this is how the conversation went when we came out the other side. Gary kicks off with his comments on the military feeling of the films.
And that, I guess that sort of war, militaristic theme is kind of the way carried over to the second video. There's clearly some kind of sense in which queer activism is in itself a kind of war on gender normativity, on the normativity around sexuality. And it seems to be also registered in the male performance artist's costume, which is not quite butch, but not quite femme. It sort of tries to echo Tom of Finlander, the gay S&M scene of the cinema, but it doesn't quite do it effectively, and yet there's that kind of Barbara Cartland jewellery in the same way. He's not perfectly lip-synced, so again, not pretending to provide any illusions that gender is natural voices in a way are even natural. And of course the blue and pink smoke at the end is a sort of gender studies 101 around the way in which colour is so arbitrary to be fixed to ideas of gender, but that's what people do. They take arbitrary things to suggest there's an essence to masculine and feminine. But the last thing I want to say is that despite their political aims and attempt to expose the working of identity, there's a sense of fun, of camp about them as well. I thought all those curtains are kind of like, it's almost like a, saying that a typical idea for gays is of course to be on stage and to be a spectacle for other people's entertainment, a la Gary Needham. But here, of course, it's using the spectacle of the curtain, of the stage, of the mirror ball to say that camp isn't just about fun, but can actually be a subversive element and an overall kind of critique that hopefully the films are trying to offer. So I'm sort of going to leave it to you. I mean, that's my interpretation, and it's not necessarily the right one, but I just want to know what things sort of popped out to you as interesting things that the work is doing.
I thought it was utterly normative in its own way. If you'd have said, what do you expect to find in a contemporary art gallery? Video installation which plays with notions of gender and intertextuality, politics without history, a certain avant-gardism, a certain kind of pleased with itselfness, challenge but without a soft challenge, outrage but actually not that outrage. It conformed to all of those things. It didn't seem to be aware that it came from specific histories, from modernism. Forget postmodernism, it didn't even have that.
It could be a postmodern space, it's equally read as such.
It was intertextuality rather than originality. It was art as a sideline of academia. I thought it was utterly empty.
Do you mean that it's just trying to be like a performance of a textbook idea?
Yeah.
In that sense, that it's lost its queerness because it's not really that unsettling. I mean, this could be partly to do with the context of a locally funded institute, that you'll never see a Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what I think in terms of whether I'm impressed or not, but I think you're onto something, and this is one of a personal problem I think with contemporary queer theory is it's lost its history and activism, and that's why I talked about gender trouble, that it's not causing trouble.
Yeah. I think that was with Capiaca, and when I first saw it, that's what I was disappointed was. It's like that Capiaca intertextuality, where things were reconstructed from the canon.
Yeah.
At the time, it was actually incredibly problematic for a lot of people in terms of like the concepts of originality, concepts of you can't copyright this, what do you do with this? And the language and what Capiaca did with it. So, and the kind of forceful person that Capiaca was, then that's
it doesn't have the power of
it's gone.
Capiaca.
Yeah, and so intertextuality, especially it's gone. I mean, especially that was one of my favourite books when I was younger. So we were into identity. So,
I mean, the interesting thing,
crazy pilots and things, and that's all gone.
You're probably right in that.
The way that the characters move and the characters within the novel change into somebody else, and then assume different identities, and then Do you
think that's lost here in a way?
Yeah.
The power of Acker.
All of those kind of power, that kind of power of Acker has just disappeared, I thought. So like I say, it must be something about the game of contemporary.
They come late to queer theory, it must be
wasn't
said.
interested in.
I think they come to late to queer theory, and that their first work, I think, is 2004. By then, a lot of the work had done, and almost like AIDS and homophobia were not mentioned again in queer theory. But it also, the Acker connection is interesting because while this is on in London at the Barbican, is another performance artist named Karen Finlay, who was censored along with Mapplethorpe by having her funding withdrawn, and she restaged some of her 80s material on AIDS and artists like David Wojnarowicz, and she was angry, it was visceral, she was crying, the performing work from the 80s, that pain of the 80s, of AIDS, of the foundation of the queer moment, and the anger and the frustration and the hate is still with her. But perhaps that doesn't have that. It's cosy. It's not angry. And does queer practices have to still be angry? What do you think today? Because that's what, in a way, you're saying there's nothing new. You're saying it lacks that bite of Acker's.
I'm not saying anger. I'm not saying anger is necessary per se. It's not so much that. It was more. I say what's queer about it when it's become normative. If it's normative contemporary art practice, split screen, dual identities, lip sync. David Lynch has done this kind of thing within narrative film, where you have different people lip syncing to different songs. So it's not desperately queer in the way that I remember the kind of reaction to Butler's talking about strategies of deconstructing, gender.
I think one of
sex, much more important than gender, deconstructing sex as a given, so is that a useful strategy? And thinking of it as a strategy rather than as
something to just play with.
Exactly, yeah. I didn't really mean anger or poverty.
Yeah. I like my queer stuff to be troubling.
Hang on, I'll just butt in here to point out that this was where I joined the conversation. Again, maybe it's actually something to do with queer theory itself, which actually, in the end, removes the troubling nature, because a lot of the troubling stuff of political progression and political activism in the 80s and 90s was based on a sense of identity and a sense of authenticity. And having removed that, a lot of the political praxis and political emphasis, and a lot of that central core around which passion can be built, is just uprooted. And maybe that's one of the things why you get this sense of emptiness, because it is just the manipulation of these pre-existing images and changing and playing with images. And this is like very quotational. And it seems also in academia that queer theory, having moved away from the driving passions of identity politics, itself just becomes this sort of bricolage, which in here is the replay of pre-existing things as a spectacle. And there is a question of authenticity then, and it says, well, there is no authenticity anyway, so we might as well all just have these different spectacles available to us to replay. And the only disturbing thing I found is, the queer thing I found is probably what we're saying now. And at the end of the I Want piece, that disco ball, that seems really sinister to me, in that it's putting this back in the dark room, and here in the dark room of the disco, which is the same as the dark room that Chelsea Manning is now confined in. That's the same room, and that room is also the room of the dark space of this gallery. And all the political disruption of queerness has been reconfined into those venues and into the palace.
And that thing about quotation, and in the first piece, when she talks about the SLA, and how she's really remembered the SLA, when Patti Smith recorded Hey Joe in 1974, and she said, and Patty Hearst, I think of you getting it off an SLA man every night. Patty Hearst had just been kidnapped. It was a real event in America, and it was shocking, and it was an affront to bourgeois, to middle class America. Now it's just, what was it? It was a quote. It was a kind
of... Seems maybe an affront to tens of thousands of people who died in the Tamil War recently, in the Tamil Civil War. So, obviously the attendees found something, shall we say, deeply problematic about the films they'd just seen, about the way that images and identities which used to relate to political activism around serious issues in a progressive politics seemed to have been appropriated for a sort of showy academic debate. This maybe prompted another attendee to ask about the uses of queer theory now.
What would be some of the more relevant discussions that queer theory could involve today with the way things are today, in England, where certain type. So certain types of sexuality have been accepted. I mean, I'm from India where a lot of it still hasn't and is still criminal, so conversations there would be very different. But here, what do you think queer theory could challenge? What kind of normativity should it be challenging?
I think it should be challenging the idea of marriage and the idea that if you're not married, whether that's gay or straight marriage, then you don't count. The idea that your relationship should be defined by the state. Marriage is homonormative, really. So I think the fantasy of the wedding that a lot of gays and lesbians are participating in is a very
Sorry to bring that home. The kitchen gas.
I think queer theory has been liberational, but along with the women's movement and the gay liberation movement in Britain over the past 40, 50 years, in allowing everybody to be, for generalising, much more allowing people to be, to behave, to dress, to appear how they wish to be. So that has been allowed, but the actual politically progressive social intent was maybe more of an egalitarian thing, has really not been carried on. So the liberation that has been brought about has been allowing everybody to be assimilated to the different shopping choices of consumer capitalism. So we can all buy whatever dresses or behave in whatever way we wish, and everybody is free to do that. But everybody is only free to be assimilated and ascribed to the mainstream capitalist project. So while queer theory originally was quite politically progressive, it almost has been appropriated as something which is available for a right-wing consumer capitalist and libertarian individualist agenda. So it falls very easily into that. And that's seen, I think, in academic institutions and the way that academic institutions now are all mainstreamed with the production of capital and education as a business. And queer theory departments all over the world do quite well on that, and that's quite different from the identity politics of the 70s and 80s. There were about 7 men and 4 women at the walkthrough. Ironically, or perhaps not ironically, just when the men had finished holding forth and being blokish and loud and territorial, just as the women were beginning to speak, a corporate event let out of the cafe bar below — we were in the lobby of the Contemporary — and obscured the conversation. This chattering drowned us out. Perhaps you couldn't have a more apt metaphor. But things cleared up again around here.
queer readings, but not queer politics. Queer readings without queer politics. So I was trying my best to think about how to read this queerly but still connect to some political point that the artists might be trying to make, because I looked at their bio and their first work is 2004. So working out, they're fairly young, so I think that they're not coming out of the experience of the late 80s and that devastation, that homophobia constantly in your face. They're coming from Berlin club culture, all this kind of where queer is exciting and not actually a fight against anything but just a way of embodying difference.
Maybe the fight for, in queer theory and for LGBT people's rights around the world is much more in other countries now. Maybe queer theory still has quite a lot to say for other countries with gender and lesbian and gay studies as well.
Issues will be different.
I mean, that, interestingly, this book, Interventions into the Representation of Ethnicity, Nationality and Sexuality, and that's perhaps another thing that gets lost, is queer theory was thought of in that sort of feminist idea of intersectional politics, that you can't think about gender without race, without class, not that they're all the same types of oppression, but they're all mutually interrelated in ways that produce power and its opposite.
I mean, my difficulty is that I sort of find queer theory right, but I also find it quite reactionary and politically right-wing. So it's really difficult. But I think one of the things that critical theorists all over, progressive and feminist theorists as well, have learned from queer theory is really the work that is done on anti-essentialism. On saying, well, you know, who you are is a product of the society you're born in, and that's what must be looked at, rather than focusing on, you know, individual, I'm
inherently in some way a white gay man, and that's how I was born, and I have this interior identity that can't challenge. Looking to the outside of people instead of to this individual identity, I think can be politically progressive.
Good. Yours truly ending on a positive note there. So, obviously, though there was some distress about some of the messages the movies seemed to the attendees to be carrying, nonetheless they were productive and stimulating and all that. Hey, the movies are still on. Get down there. Make up your own minds. It's queer stuff in a major cultural space, and it's free. And there are 4 other rooms in the gallery as part of the current exhibition. In the next room there are headphones hanging from the ceiling, endlessly playing the rolling, bumptious jazz of Sun Ra. And in a further room there are intriguing, vacuum-packed things which reward a closer scrutiny. However, that's all from me, yours truly, Russell Christie, and from the Aquaricon this time. Doubtless, in the future, we'll find more things to say about performance, performativity, and queer theory. If you miss me in the meantime, my novel The Queer Diary of Mordred Vienna is available online or from 5 Leaves Bookshop down the alley opposite the Tourist Information Office in town. I've been your host and guide, for now. Keep it strange, keep it on its toes, keep it perpetually revolving, and keep it queer.
She